Hi, I'm Rabbi Jerry Miller, and it's my joy to be able to lead us together for some sessions as we look through a survey of the great books written by Shaul or Paul to the congregations in Rome and Galatia, the book of Romans and Galatians. As a survey we will be doing together. Much of our time, of course, will be spent in Romans since it's a much longer piece, but we will look at both letters over these sessions. I do want to encourage you to be sure to take time to read the passages that we don't have the time to read during the teachings. Just for the sake of time, we'll be referring to passages, but it's important that you read them on your own so that you're following the material that we're covering. The book of Romans is really one of the great writings of the Brit Chadashah, the New Covenant Scriptures, as it covers so many issues that are necessary for us as believers to be living victorious lives before the Lord. We have little time and much material to cover in these sessions, and so we can't take much time for introduction about the book of Romans, but some portions of the letter we will go through very closely, looking very closely at it. Other portions we'll have to go through a little bit more quickly and generally. But Romans is one of Paul's later letters which explains why there's so much theological content in this letter. Very little is known actually about the congregation in Rome, and as a result, much of the letter has to be understood without really knowing the circumstances that might have led to Paul's writing of this letter. The congregation would have likely been made up of a majority of Gentile believers with possibly a small number of Jewish believers. Probably it would have been founded by Messianic Jewish believers who perhaps would have been in Jerusalem on the day of Shavuot or Pentecost when Peter preached that first message in Acts chapter 2, and the Spirit of God fell in power, and there were Jewish people from the nations there. Well, it's very likely that there were Jewish believers, Jewish people who came to the Lord from Rome who went back and were probably instrumental in the founding of the congregation in Rome. However, because of the Emperor Claudius, many of the Jews were actually expelled from Rome for a season, and so they would have all been gone from the congregation, but then after a while, after Claudius died, they came back, and this brought out a number of issues that I think Paul felt he needed to deal with in terms of the relationships of Jews and Gentiles, believers together in the congregation. And so this gives a little bit of background to the letter. The letter has three sections. Chapters 1 through 8 would be seen as foundational doctrine. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time there. Chapters 9 through 11 continues on, but with a little different emphasis as it focuses on Israel and the Jewish people in God's plans. And then chapters 12 through 16, Paul gives some practical instructions based on all that he's written up to that point. Beginning in chapter 1, if you read through verses 1 through 7, these first 7 verses, we find Paul giving a brief statement of his own faith, of his own ministry, and just some very key foundational points that we see here, even in some simple statements that he makes in these early verses. Verse 2 declares the good news, the gospel of Yeshua, as having been promised before through the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. In other words, it's the fulfillment of all that Judaism was to be looking to. Verse 3, Yeshua is spoken of as the seed of David. In other words, he's the fulfillment of the Messianic hope that had been alive among the Jewish people for centuries. He came according to the flesh. He came into this world as a man. Yet, verse 4, he was declared to be the Son of God with power as he was raised from the dead. So we just see even these first 4 verses, just how much theology, how much content Paul gets into this just in a few verses here. Verses 8 through 15, he gives us some more introductory statements. And then verse 14, Shaul makes a very important statement that reveals something of his own heart as a believer and really his grateful response to God for saving him. He makes the statement and says, I am a debtor. I owe others what has been given to me. See, Paul understood that the fitting response to God's mercy brought into our lives is for us to be a people who would bring ourselves the gospel of the Messiah to all people, Jew and Gentile. Paul realized that his time on this earth was for one purpose, and that was to make known the life and power of Yeshua's salvation. Now, verses 16 and 17, we find, I think, a summary in just 2 verses, what I would say is the main theme of the entire letter. Verse 16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, the good news of Messiah, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Gentile." Paul is writing to a congregation in the city that was truly the center of world power in that day. Think about it. Power was at the heart of the Roman mindset. Political power, military power. The Roman Empire was based on the concept of power. But Paul is saying there is a power of God that leads to the salvation of a life, the saving of a life, a power that's capable of rescuing and delivering human beings from slavery and bondage. And greater than the power of an army to conquer nations is the power of the gospel to conquer the human heart so that God can establish his rule in the very heart of a human being. The good news, the gospel, is the power of God to conquer the human heart. But not by force like the Roman armies did. Rather, God conquers the human heart through love and grace and the mercy that are so central to the message that's in Yeshua. The word power is from the Greek word dunamis. This word suggests a power that has a dynamic work in its impact on a human being. In other words, the good news is dynamic in impacting the human heart. The gospel, it's not just information. It's not just a theory. It's not just a philosophy. There is a dynamic power that's in the good news that has the capacity to impact a person's life in a tangible way. And of course, this theme of a transformed life becomes the main message that we do see throughout the book of Romans. This concept of the dynamic power of the good news of Messiah is something we'll develop much more as we get into especially chapters 4 through 8. Now, for whom will this good news be dynamic? For whom will it be life-changing? It says, for all who believe, for all who trust the Lord with their lives. And then he writes, for the Jew first, and also for the Gentile. For Jew and Gentile, the good news is the power of God unto salvation and the only way to salvation. Now, in what sense is the gospel to the Jew first? What did Shaul mean by that? Well, I think he's presenting to them a concept that he wants the Gentile church to understand, seeing the priority of having a burden and concern for Jewish people receiving the gospel, even a responsibility for the church to share the Messiah with the Jewish people. Not because Jewish people are more important in God's thinking, it's not a question of that, but it's simply a scriptural priority. It's a question of God's order. It's a scriptural priority to see God's ministry restored among his original covenant people. It's part of a biblical strategy, actually, I believe, related to world evangelism, which we'll see a little bit more clearly when we get to chapters 9 through 11 in later sessions. So, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. It speaks of a historical pattern, as of course, obviously, the gospel was originally brought to the Jewish people first. Yeshua came to his own people, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then, of course, it spread to the nations of the world. So it speaks of a historical pattern, but I believe it also speaks of a spiritual principle that we're to understand. And then verse 17 is also a very key verse. For in it, meaning the proclamation of the gospel, in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Here we find what we might see as the summary statement for the entire letter to the Romans. First of all, the righteousness of God is revealed. It's an important statement. God's righteousness, he says, is revealed. And that word revealed, it means to uncover something that has previously been hidden. So, see what he's saying here. The kind of righteousness that comes through trusting the gospel of the Messiah is a righteousness that was previously hidden. In other words, it's a level of righteousness and relationship with God through Yeshua that had never before been available to mankind until Yeshua's own death and resurrection. So, this is a righteousness that was not available to man by following the Levitical sacrificial system. Remember, the Torah called for bringing the sacrifices and offerings for forgiveness of sin, but that could not bring the people into the kind of righteousness that comes through the new covenant in Yeshua. An Israelite prior to the new covenant could follow all the details of the sacrificial system, all the offerings and sacrifices, and still he would never be brought into the true righteousness with God that's now being revealed through the new covenant. So this righteousness revealed through the new covenant is to have an impact on man that man had never known before this time. This righteousness, he says, is from faith to faith. Paul is emphasizing very strongly that it's faith that is key to experiencing this righteousness of God. We cannot achieve this righteousness by our own works. We are forced to put our trust in God himself as the only one who can make us righteous. The word faith, it really communicates the idea of putting our trust in someone else. We're trusting our own lives into the hands of another. So if we want to experience God's righteousness, we must get our focus off of ourselves. We've got to get our focus off of our own capacity for doing good works. And we trust God as the one who does the work. The key in faith is that we are trusting our righteousness to someone else. I cannot accomplish the righteousness of God no matter how many good works I can come up with. So this righteousness begins by faith. It begins by our trusting. And then we continue on in this work of righteousness according to the same principle of faith, from faith to faith, or this principle of trusting. We put no confidence in what we can do to be righteous. Our confidence is totally in what the Lord himself has done, what he has provided. Now then, Paul quotes from the prophet Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 4. He says, "The just shall live by faith." Well, I think it's important that he quotes Habakkuk here because he has just said that this righteousness that God was providing, this righteousness that was something that was previously hidden. Yet by quoting the prophets, Paul is showing that the salvation he's speaking about is a fulfillment of the Torah and the prophets. Yes, it was previously hidden, but it's coming to light. But this is the very salvation that the Torah and the prophets has always pointed to. This righteousness that comes to us through Yeshua is a righteousness that fulfills the law and the prophets. It was not to be seen as a new religion. But this is a righteousness spoken of by the prophets themselves. The Hebrew Scriptures point us to this righteousness that comes by faith or by trusting. Now, the rabbis today in traditional Judaism, they talk about the issue of mitzvot, or the commandments, keeping God's commandments. That's how we become righteous. And yet, as we see from what Shaul is saying here, that is not God's way that we can come into righteousness. Now, for the rest of chapter 1, Shaul describes the declining condition of mankind. From creation onward, he's giving an understanding of really why it's such a totally miraculous thing for God to actually change the nature of a human being. Why is it so miraculous? Because the history of man shows that man's constant a response to God has been a rejection of God's ways. Constantly, man's sin getting worse and worse and worse in spite of God clearly revealing himself. This is Paul's description. Verses 18 through 32 in chapter 1, Paul mentions several issues, all related to man's accountability before God. Verses 19 and 20, he makes the point, there has always been a revelation of the knowledge of God to all the earth. Note the wording. Verse 20 says, God's attributes are clearly seen. All mankind has had the opportunity to see that God is real and that he has revealed himself to man. And yet, verses 21 through 23, the tendency of man throughout the ages has always been to reject the clearly revealed knowledge of God. Then verses 24 through 32, it describes the total moral decay of mankind as he has chosen to reject this revelation of God over and over again. I mean, it's a very powerful description as it speaks of the result of man living apart from God's righteousness. In other words, until this righteousness by faith in Messiah would be available to man, man could only seem to go in the direction of sin and rebellion. This section is so important to the whole letter of Romans because Paul is showing us that man as he is apart from God is ultimately an enemy of God, drifting further and further from God. Man can intellectually know about God's existence, but knowing this is not enough. Man still ends up going in the direction of sin, death, destruction, rebellion, unless there's a change in his nature. See, Paul is setting us up here. He's setting us up for what will be the main theme for really much of the letter, and certainly the next 7 chapters very intensively. The only hope for man, in light of history, would be a salvation that in a real way, in a powerful way, can actually change man's nature. The nature of a human being must be changed if this salvation is to give man any kind of real hope for true righteousness. We really need to understand this so that we can appreciate what's happened in our lives if we've received the righteousness of the Messiah. The most wonderful miracle we could ever experience has happened to us if we have received his righteousness by trusting. He has changed our nature so that we are no longer his enemies. Think about that for a moment. Because when this really becomes revelation to our hearts, it removes all the limitations to what we can become in the Messiah because God has actually changed our nature. There has been a real transformation in our lives. Now, Paul continues on in the next chapter to show that all of mankind has the same need. And so in these 2 chapters, he's addressing really, I would say, 3 levels of mankind. First of all, those who are totally given over to sin and rebellion. These are the ones who are described in chapter 1. Those utterly given over to rebellion and idolatry and lust and just complete moral depravity. But then, Paul anticipates that people who've maybe not sunk to such depths of blatant sin, maybe they think they're okay in relation to God. Those who would perhaps think themselves to be okay because maybe they try to be good, they try to be a little bit religious, they haven't done serious evil in their lives. That's the second level of people he's talking to. And then the third level of mankind he's addressing is the Jewish people, those who have God's Torah as a guide for their lives. And for all 3 of these levels of mankind, he says, no one is free from sin's power. All are judged with the same judgment. Now, why is that? How can it be that the most rebellious is judged with the same judgment as the Jewish person who's trying to keep Torah, or just anybody who's trying to be good and trying to please God but just falling short? Well, the answer is seen in a simple statement in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 2, he says this: we know that the judgment of God is according to truth against those who practice such things. The judgment of God is according to truth. In other words, God's judgment is not based on how bad somebody's sin is. One person lies, another person commits murder. The one who murders is judged while the one who lies may not be judged. No, that's not how it works. God's judgment is according to truth. That means that the issue is not, is one person's sin less bad than another's? The issue is God's perfect righteousness is the only standard that's acceptable. Therefore, his judgment will be on all who fall short of that righteousness. Now, this is important because it leaves everyone with the same dilemma. Every human being is deserving of God's judgment, and that is why everyone needs the power of God's righteousness in our lives in order to be saved from that judgment. The need of every individual, from the idol worshiper to the religious Jew, is to be impacted in our hearts by the salvation of God as we receive the dynamic righteousness of Yeshua himself, a righteousness that has a power to change us from the inside out. For those who speculated that the Jewish people having the Torah would be exempt from the judgment of God, Paul makes it clear, having the Torah is not the issue at all. The Torah is the very thing that actually judges our actions, we find in verse 12 of chapter 2. So this theme continues through chapter 2, which we're not going to look at verse by verse, but I encourage you, read it through on your own. It's very powerful material. And he, of course, concludes the chapter with some discussion on the tendency of the Jewish people to point to the issue of circumcision. Circumcision showed that Jewish people had a covenant with God. We're, as a nation, in a covenant relationship with God. And so their thinking would have been, how can the same principles of judgment apply? Well, Paul's answer is, what good is circumcision if you're still violating the Torah? And then he closes the chapter by focusing on the issue of circumcision of the heart as the key issue here. Now, in chapter 2, at the end of the chapter, he makes a statement that can be a little confusing, but he says this. He says, he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart. This is often a misunderstood statement. Paul is emphasizing that the new covenant is really an inward work in man. Circumcision is an outward sign of a covenant relationship, but the new covenant is ultimately an inward work in the heart. It's not a covenant of outward laws and rules that govern our lives. The emphasis is on what God is doing in us inwardly. Now, when he refers to the one who is a true Jew, Paul is doing kind of a play on words, actually, I think. The word Jew in Hebrew is Yehudah, and the generic meaning of that word is praise. So a Jew, ultimately, the biblical definition of a Jew is one who is a praiser, a worshiper of God. So the idea is, the true worshiper of God is one who has experienced the circumcision of the heart by the work of the Holy Spirit. The Jewish person who is an ethnic Jew is incomplete until God does a circumcision in his heart. And that's the idea here. Now, Paul anticipates a possible question from his readers. And this is a style that Paul uses frequently throughout the letter to the Romans. He'll ask a question because he's anticipating that such a question would be asked by somebody who is listening or reading. And the question here is there then any advantage to being a Jew? Well, he answers the question in chapter 3, verse 2, and he says, yes, to them were committed the revelation of God. There is a calling that God has for the Jewish people. There is a purpose of God related to Israel. Then Paul brings in a whole series of quotations from the Psalms and Isaiah that make it absolutely clear all mankind is in the same situation in relation to sin. We see this in verses 10 through 18. Sin has affected all of humanity, but the judgment of God also impacts all of humanity. Well, we're going to pick up here in the next session as we move further into chapter 3.